What makes a man jump into a river crawling with alligators? Instinct, guilt, or something deeper, something tied not to logic, but to a bond few would ever understand? The air was thick with heat and memory. Summer in the Florida Panhandle had a weight to it, dense, humid, unforgiving. Jack Morrison, 62, moved slowly along the riverbank near his modest wooden cabin, nestled just out of reach of civilization. Spanish moss hung like ghosts from the cypress trees, and the muddy waters of the Apalachicola flowed with a deceptive calm. It was the kind of place you chose when you didn't want to be found. Jack hadn't wanted to be found in a long time. He had built this life with deliberate isolation, a single hammock on the porch, a battered canoe tied to a post, a radio that hadn't worked since the last hurricane. But he wasn't alone. Scout was the only soul Jack let stay. A mutt, maybe part retriever, maybe part shepherd, all heart. The dog had wandered into Jack's life 5 years ago, limping from a snare trap someone had left in the woods. Scout was half-starved and bleeding, but his eyes, those soft, alert, unyielding eyes, met Jack's, and something passed between them. Jack took him in, wrapped his paw in an old t-shirt, and fed him canned beans. Since then, they'd been inseparable. To anyone else, Scout was just a dog. But to Jack, he was witness and warden to the ghosts he never talked about. Jack had once been a firefighter, a good one, brave, sharp, reliable. But there was a day, one day, when all the training and courage in the world hadn't been enough. A warehouse fire, a collapsing beam, a small hand reaching through the smoke, and then nothing. The boy hadn't made it. Jack had. And that was the problem. He quit not long after, lost his marriage, stopped answering phone calls. He let the silence take him. But Scout never asked questions. He didn't need to. He followed Jack on morning walks, slept beside his bed, sat quietly during long nights when memories made it impossible to close his eyes. Scout had saved Jack, even if Jack would never say it aloud. That afternoon was like any other. The sun beat down through the trees, and the cicadas shrieked like distant sirens. Jack had taken Scout down to the water for their usual walk. The river was higher than normal, bloated by weeks of rain. The surface looked calm, but Jack knew better. Underneath, the current moved fast and hard, cutting deep channels that could suck down even the strongest swimmer. And then there were the gators. Jack had seen them before. Big, prehistoric things gliding through the water like logs with eyes. He kept his distance, always cautious. But the river was their home as much as his now, and as long as he respected the balance, they left him alone. They were about halfway through their walk when Scout froze. His ears perked. Jack followed his gaze and saw it. A flash of brown fur, gangly legs stumbling through the brush. A young deer, maybe 6 months old, panicked and alone, had strayed too close to the muddy edge. It was all bone and fear. And then it slipped. The deer crashed into the water with a splash that shattered the stillness. Jack's heart seized. He looked at Scout. "Stay," he commanded sharply, voice cutting through the heat. Then Jack was running. He didn't think. Training, instinct, muscle memory from another life kicked in. He ran down the embankment, boots skidding in the wet soil, arms outstretched. The fawn was struggling in the current, legs flailing, eyes wide with terror. Jack reached the edge, reached for it, and the world gave way. The mud beneath him collapsed. 1 second he was reaching, the next he was falling, his own body thrown into the river like a rag doll. The cold punched the breath from his lungs. The current caught him immediately, pulling him downriver, spinning him. Water filled his ears, his nose, his mouth. He surfaced once, gasping. The fawn was gone. Everything was a blur of motion and noise. He reached for anything, roots, branches, anything to stop himself. But the river had no mercy. Then something else hit the water, a splash behind him, louder than the others. He twisted in the current, coughing, blinking away the water from his eyes. And there, cutting through the river like a bullet, was Scout. Jack's mind reeled. He had told him to stay. Why didn't he stay? But there he was, swimming hard, paddling against the current with a power Jack hadn't known he had. The dog's eyes locked on him, and there was no hesitation, no fear, only focus. Jack felt his own strength faltering. His limbs were heavy, his body battered against rocks and submerged logs. The river twisted him sideways, and for a moment he went under. Darkness, pressure, silence, then fur. A paw against his shoulder, a tug at his collar. Scout. The dog had reached him, was trying to pull him toward the bank. Jack sputtered, choking on river water, but his hand found Scout's thick scruff and held tight. The current fought them, dragging them backward, and then came the sound. A ripple, a splash, different this time, lower, heavier. Jack turned his head. A pair of eyes broke the surface 20 feet away, unblinking, watching. Alligator. Jack's blood turned to ice. Another splash behind it. A second gator. Maybe more. The river around them was alive now, a churn of threat and instinct and hunger. Scout growled, a low, vibrating sound that rose in his throat. He barked once, sharp, defiant. He swam in circles around Jack, positioning himself between his human and the approaching danger. Jack tried to kick, to help, but his legs weren't responding the way they should. He was exhausted, half drowned. He'd hit something during the fall, his ribs screamed with every breath. The bank looked farther away than ever. Another tail sliced the water, this one closer. The gator was accelerating, head low, body coiled in a slow, deadly glide. Jack had seen that posture before. That wasn't curiosity, that was a charge. "Scout, no!" he cried, voice ragged. Too late. Scout surged forward, straight at the gator. The scene played out in flashes, fur against scales, teeth bared, the dog throwing himself toward the monstrous shape in the water. The gator snapped, huge jaws crashing shut just shy of Scout's flank. The dog twisted midair, landed on the reptile's back, claws digging into leathery hide. Jack screamed, tried to crawl toward them. Couldn't. Scout's distraction was enough. The gator thrashed, furious, but confused. Scout launched himself back into the water, swimming hard toward Jack again. The other gators were circling now, closer. And still, Scout didn't turn away. He swam to Jack's side again, nose under his arm, pushing. Jack coughed, clawed for the edge. His fingers scraped something. Roots, solid ground. With one final push, he dragged himself out of the water, collapsing on the mud. Scout followed, trembling, soaked, his side bleeding from a gash Jack hadn't noticed in the chaos. They lay there, gasping, side by side. The river behind them rippled once more, and then was still. Scout nudged Jack's hand with his snout, whining softly. Jack, for the first time in years, felt something shift inside him, something heavy and rusted giving way. His hand closed around the dog's wet fur. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Scout had jumped. Scout had saved him. And Jack, broken and breathless and baptized by the river, understood. He owed that dog more than his life. He owed him his soul. What does a dog know of fear? Of death? Can he sense it, name it, defy it? Or is his courage something purer, the kind that doesn't pause to think? The ground beneath Jack Morrison was solid again, but only just. He lay on the muddy slope of the riverbank, every breath scraping raw against his ribs, his limbs trembling with exhaustion and cold. Scout, soaked and panting, stayed pressed against his side, bleeding from a wound on his flank that Jack still hadn't fully assessed. All around them the swamp murmured, a sinister lullaby of insects, birds, and the distant splash of water that made Jack's gut twist. They weren't safe yet, not really. The river might have released them, but the wild didn't let go that easily. Jack tried to sit up. Pain exploded through his side, and he let out a sharp grunt. His hand went to Scout, feeling the wetness of the fur, the ragged gash that still seeped blood. Scout's tail thumped twice against the mud. His eyes found Jack's, calm, alert, waiting. "Damn fool," Jack rasped, his voice like sandpaper. "Why'd you follow me?" Scout blinked slowly, panting. He didn't need to answer. He'd already answered, with a leap into the current and a battle no sane creature would have chosen. Jack knew they had to move. The sun was dropping, and with it, the temperature. But more than that, predators moved differently at dusk, quieter, hungrier. He needed to get Scout out of there, to safety, to someone who could stop the bleeding. The nearest town, Wewahichka, was nearly a half-hour drive, That meant they had to get back to the truck, a mile up the trail, maybe more, depending on how the current had carried them downstream. He forced himself to stand. The world tilted dangerously. He grabbed onto a sapling for balance, breathing hard. Every muscle in his body screamed, but he couldn't think about that now. "Come on, boy, let's go." Scout got to his feet, shaky but determined. He limped heavily, favoring his left side. Jack tried to lift him, but Scout resisted, pushing forward on his own. Stubborn damn dog, brave beyond all reason. They began the slow, agonizing climb through the thick underbrush, roots clawing at their feet, vines tangling around their legs. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the smell of earth and blood. Jack's ears strained for every sound, the crack of a twig, the shift of leaves, the splash of water behind them. At one point, Scout stopped. His ears perked, body rigid. Jack froze too, following the dog's gaze toward the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows. But Jack had learned to trust Scout's instincts more than his own. Then he saw it, a ripple of movement in the water just past the brush. Low, silent. Another gator, or maybe the same one. Its snout broke the surface for a second before disappearing again. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. They had to keep moving. Scout pushed ahead, ignoring his limp, pushing through thorny scrub and brambles. Jack followed, one hand on his side, the other constantly checking behind him. Every sound felt like a threat. Every second stretched into a fragile eternity. They found the trail eventually. Not the one they came in on, but a side path Jack had used to collect firewood. It would lead to the cabin if they were lucky. If they weren't, it might lead them deeper into the wetlands. But there was no time to hesitate. Scout kept moving, head low, tail stiff, eyes flicking side to side. Jack spoke to him softly as they walked. Words that didn't matter, not really, just sound to remind both of them they were still here. "You saved me, you know that?" he muttered, his voice cracking. "You crazy mutt. You saved me when I didn't deserve it." Scout looked back once as if to say, "Of course I did." They reached the cabin as the last of the sunlight bled out of the sky. Jack half-carried, half-dragged Scout up the porch steps. Inside, he laid the dog gently on the floor near the old wood stove. The first aid kit was tucked in a cabinet under the sink, dusty, disorganized, but stocked. Jack cleaned the wound as best he could, his fingers shaking. Scout didn't flinch once, didn't whine, just watched him, breathing slow and shallow. It was deep, deeper than Jack wanted to admit. The gator's jaw had barely caught him, but it had torn through skin and muscle. He didn't know if it hit anything vital. He only knew the bleeding hadn't stopped. Jack wrapped the wound with gauze and whatever clean fabric he could find. His phone, left on the counter during the walk, had no service. Typical. He cursed, threw on a shirt, and went to the truck. It started on the third try. He wrapped Scout in an old quilt and laid him in the passenger seat. As he drove toward town, one hand on the wheel, the other on Scout's side, Jack couldn't stop the thoughts. Memories of the warehouse fire crashed in waves. The smoke, the weight of the air, the boy's scream, the moment he realized he couldn't get back inside, the guilt, the helplessness. He had failed back then. He had run when he should have stayed. But today, Scout hadn't run. Scout had jumped, not because he was trained, not because he was told, but because he saw Jack in danger and didn't hesitate. That kind of loyalty, that kind of bravery, it stripped Jack down to the core, made him ask himself things he had buried for years. Why had he lived when others hadn't? Why had this dog, this animal he had rescued from the brink, been willing to die for him? Jack didn't have answers, but as the truck rumbled down the back roads toward the vet clinic, he felt something shift inside. A thread tugged loose in his chest. He hadn't cried in years. But now, as Scout's breath grew shallower beside him, the tears came silently, hot, cutting through dirt and dried blood. The clinic's lights glowed like a beacon in the night. "Doctor." Langston was already closing up when Jack stormed in, Scout in his arms, voice cracking as he begged for help. The vet didn't ask questions, just took the dog and disappeared into the back. Jack waited in the front room for hours. He paced, sat, stood again. His clothes were still damp. His skin smelled of river water and fear. He replayed it all. The fall, the splash, Scout's leap, the gator's jaws. He saw it over and over until he wasn't sure if it was memory or nightmare. Finally, Doctor. Langston returned. His face was unreadable. "He's alive," he said quietly. "It was close, real close, but he's strong." Jack sank into a chair, body collapsing with the weight of relief. He wiped his face, said nothing, nodded once. The doctor sat beside him, told him Scout would need rest, maybe surgery, antibiotics for sure. It would be a long recovery. Jack listened, but only part of him heard. The rest was still back in the river, still watching that brown blur dive into danger without a second thought. He realized something else then, something terrifying and beautiful. Scout had done what Jack couldn't do all those years ago. He had gone back into the fire, not because he had to, because he loved. That night, Jack stayed by Scout's side, curled in a stiff chair in the vet's back room. He didn't sleep. He didn't want to. Instead, he watched every breath Scout took, every rise and fall of his chest, each twitch of his paws. In that room, under sterile lights and the quiet beep of a heart monitor, Jack Morrison began to understand redemption. Not as a clean slate, not as erasure, but as a debt, repaid not with words but with courage, with sacrifice, with a leap into dark waters when it mattered most. And for the first time in decades, Jack didn't feel like a coward. He felt human again, because his dog had reminded him how many lives are lived in the space between one heartbeat and the next. In the moment, a dog jumps into the jaws of death for the man who once saved him. What kind of story is written there? A story of instinct or of love? The sterile smell of antiseptics clung to Jack Morrison's clothes long after he left the veterinary clinic. For 3 nights, he hadn't returned to the cabin. He had stayed in that stiff plastic chair beside Scout's recovery kennel, watching the rise and fall of the dog's chest, like a man guarding a flame in the wind. Every breath the dog took was a miracle. Every twitch of his ears a reminder that the leap hadn't been in vain. Scout was going to make it. The wound had missed his lungs by inches. The gator's teeth had torn through muscle, but the dog's sheer will had kept him afloat until Jack could drag them both to shore. Doctor Langston had called it a survival fueled by something bigger than instinct. Jack knew what it was: loyalty, love. That unspoken, unwavering bond forged not in comfort, but in broken places. Jack hadn't always been good at expressing things. Emotion had been something he buried under duty, under action, under silence. But now, sitting in the quiet hum of the clinic, his hand resting on the warm fur of his battered friend, the words finally came. "You saved me," he whispered. "Not just in that river. You've been saving me every day since you walked into my life." Scout blinked slowly, his tail brushing once against the blanket. No judgment, no expectation, just presence. Jack thought back to the boy in the warehouse, the scream that still echoed in his dreams, the fire that stole more than just a child's life. It stole the part of Jack that believed he could be whole again. For years he had been running from that day, punishing himself in silence. But in a cruel twist of fate, it was a dog, this mutt with a limp and a crooked ear, who had brought him back to shore, literally and spiritually. Scout had no reason to jump after him. He could have stayed. He could have barked from the shore, but he dove. And in that leap, something broke open in Jack's chest. Something he didn't know was still alive. After the clinic discharged Scout, Jack carried him to the truck like a child. He built a bed in the passenger seat with old quilts, stopped every few miles to check on him, and when they finally reached the cabin, he carried him inside with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. For weeks, Jack's world narrowed. No fishing, no wandering. Just medicine, rest, and slow walks under the trees. Scout healed inch by inch. The limp became less pronounced. The spark returned to his eyes. But something else had changed too, something in Jack. He started speaking more. Not to people, there still weren't many of those around, but to Scout, out loud, like a man confessing to a priest who wouldn't judge him. He told him about the fire, about the kid, about the guilt that clung like soot. He told him about his marriage, about the things he could never fix, about how some mornings he hadn't wanted to wake up, and the only reason he did was because Scout needed food, needed a walk, needed him. And Scout listened. Always listening. When Jack cried, Scout nudged his hand with his nose and rested his head on his knee. And Jack, for the first time in a long time, let himself be held, even if it was by a dog. The days turned warmer, the river receded, life found its rhythm again. But Jack was not the same man who had once chosen exile. He began keeping a journal, short entries, thoughts he couldn't say aloud. He even called his daughter after years of silence. She cried on the phone, said she thought he was dead. Jack told her about Scout. She said she wanted to meet him. One morning, as Scout lay in the sunspot near the porch, Jack sat beside him, sipping coffee. A gator cruised silently across the water in the distance. Jack didn't flinch. He just watched it pass. "Not all monsters are out there," he said aloud, half to Scout, half to himself. "Some live in us." Scout's ear twitched. "But I'm learning how to face them." There was no grand ending. No moment where the heavens opened or redemption was handed down from above. It was quieter than that. It was Scout nudging his food bowl toward Jack when he forgot to eat. It was Jack letting himself smile again when Scout chased a squirrel and lost spectacularly. It was the cabin filling with warmth instead of ghosts. Jack started volunteering once a week at the local shelter. At first, he just walked dogs. Then he started helping with the rescues. People noticed. Some even remembered him. "You're Jack Morrison, right? The firefighter?" He used to flinch at that question. Now he nodded. "I used to be," he'd say. "Still am, I guess. Just in a different way now." He told Scout's story to anyone who would listen. Not for pity, not for attention, but because it mattered. Because in that story there was something bigger than a river and a gator and an old man with too much past. There was a truth, that sometimes the ones we save become the ones who save us. People started coming to the cabin, neighbors, strangers. Lost dogs found their way to Jack's porch. He took them in, helped find homes for them. Some stayed, some left. But Scout remained the heartbeat of it all. One evening, a boy from the shelter sat beside Jack, petting Scout gently. "Why'd he do it?" the boy asked. "Why'd your dog jump into the river like that?" Jack looked at Scout, then at the boy. "Because love," he said simply, "doesn't ask for guarantees. It just leaps." Scout wagged his tail. Jack smiled. Years passed. Scout grew older, slower, but the light never left his eyes. On his final morning, he curled up at the foot of Jack's bed, let out a deep sigh, and closed his eyes like he'd done 1,000 times before. There was no pain, no fear, just peace. Jack buried him near the river, beneath the old cypress where they used to sit. He carved a small wooden marker. "Scout, the dog who jumped." And underneath, "He saved me." Every day. Jack visits that spot often. Sometimes he talks, sometimes he just listens. The river still flows, the gators still glide, and life continues. But Jack has changed. He no longer hides from the world. He builds things now, not just furniture, but connection. He writes, he speaks, he lives. Because once a dog jumped into danger to save him, and in doing so taught him how to truly be alive. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of a bond you've shared or a quiet hero you've known, hold on to it. Share it. Or better yet, look around. There are animals out there waiting not just to be rescued, but to rescue someone in return. Maybe even you. Sometimes all it takes is one leap.